The European Union was never built to become a single country in the same way the United States became one. I think people sometimes miss that because the EU has a parliament, it has a court system, a central bank, trade rules, agreements in some regions, and now increasingly, even coordinated defense discussions after the Russia Ukraine campaign changed European security thinking. So, from the outside, it can look like Europe is slowly becoming a giant federal state, but the foundation underneath it still works differently. The EU was built through treaties negotiated between sovereign countries that already had their own constitutions, their own languages and militaries, legal traditions, tax systems, and national identities long before the EU existed. France does not see itself as a province of Europe. Poland does not either. Italy also doesn't. They cooperate, yes, but they still fundamentally view themselves as independent nations first. The reason this is important to understand is because constitutions are not only legal documents, they are psychological agreements. They only really work when populations believe they belong to one political community. The United States could build a federal constitution because over time, Americans developed a national identity enough to support centralized authority. Europe does not have that same emotional foundation. The person in Portugal may support European trade cooperation while completely rejecting the idea that Brussels should permanently override Portuguese democratic decisions on maybe culture, migration, taxation, or speech laws. These are different things. Cooperation is not the same as political fusion. The failed 2005 European Constitution referendum exposed this reality very clearly. France and the Netherlands rejected the proposal, even though both countries were deeply integrated into the EU already. It was not necessarily hatred toward Europe itself, it was a discomfort with the idea that Europe was drifting away from being an alliance of nations and moving toward becoming a centralized political identity people never consciously agreed to create. And once voters rejected that constitutional project, EU leadership also shifted back toward treaty management instead of direct federalism. That tells you something important about the limits of integration in Europe. The system can move forward economically faster than populations are emotionally willing to move politically. The current treaty system is messy sometimes. There is no point pretending otherwise. Different courts interpret powers differently. EU institutions negotiate constantly with member states, right? Certain laws apply in some areas, but not in others. It can feel slow and incredibly bureaucratic, but strangely enough, that flexibility may actually be the reason the EU has survived as long as it has. A rigid federal constitution would probably force Europe into direct sovereignty conflicts much faster. Right now, the ambiguity gives countries room to cooperate without feeling fully absorbed. Take Germany, for example. The German Constitutional Court has repeatedly reminded Brussels that German sovereignty still has limits that cannot simply disappear because EU institutions want more integration. Poland has made similar arguments, although often in more confrontational ways. Even countries that strongly support the EU still want national courts to remain powerful. That tension is built into the structure because the EU is balancing two realities simultaneously. It wants continental coordination, but it also depends on national legitimacy to function at all. And honestly, when you look at how the system operates during crisis, you start seeing why the treaty model exists. During the Eurozone debt crisis, richer countries like Germany became cautious about deeper fiscal integration because taxpayers did not want permanent liability for decisions made elsewhere. During the migration crisis, countries disagreed sharply over border responsibilities. During the Ukraine campaign after 2022, Europe coordinated sanctions and military aid surprisingly effectively, But even then, individual states still protected their own energy needs, their industrial concerns, and domestic politics differently. Hungary moved differently from Poland, France moved differently from Estonia, and these are not small disagreements. They reflect separate national priorities that a single federal constitution would struggle to contain peacefully. And then there is language and culture, which people often underestimate. The EU has 24 official languages. 24. That alone changes governance enormously. Laws, court rulings, negotiations, media discussions, public debates, everything becomes slower and more layered. A single constitution assumes a shared political conversation. Europe still operates through overlapping national conversations instead. The treaty structure, imperfect as it is, allows Europe to function without forcing complete political uniformity onto societies that are simply not identical. What is interesting now is that technology and AI are starting to pressure the system in new ways because modern governance increasingly depends on digital infrastructure, on data regulation, cybersecurity coordination, and platform control. These things move much faster than traditional treaty negotiations, and that creates tension. The EU has actually become very influential globally in tech regulation precisely because it acts collectively in certain areas. The Digital Markets Act and AI Act are good examples. Large technology companies often adjust globally because complying with EU standards becomes economically necessary if they want to access the European market. But here again, Europe's strength comes from coordinated regulation, right? Not necessarily from being a single constitutional state. The EU can act like a regulatory superpower without becoming a federal nation. People sometimes assume that centralization is always required for effectiveness. It is not. Sometimes network coordination achieves similar outcomes while preserving national autonomy underneath. You can even see this in defense discussions happening around last year and this year. European leaders increasingly talk about strategic autonomy because they are nervous about relying too heavily on the United States for military protection, especially after repeated uncertainty around NATO commitments during different American election cycles. But even while Europe discusses stronger defense coordination, countries still hesitate to surrender full military sovereignty. France thinks differently about nuclear deterrence than Germany does. Eastern European countries closer to Russia think differently about security urgency than maybe Spain or Portugal do. And these differences are often structural. And honestly, forcing a single federal constitution onto this environment could destabilize the entire project because then every disagreement becomes existential. Right now, countries can disagree while remaining inside a flexible framework. Under a rigid federal constitution, disagreements over migration quotas, digital censorship standards, taxation, AI governance, or military obligations could start feeling like constitutional battles over national survival itself. The current treaty system lowers the temperature slightly because states still retain visible sovereignty. They can tell their populations, we are cooperating, but we are not disappearing. Africa is quietly watching all of this too, probably more carefully than many European policymakers realize, because the EU model has often been presented internationally as a kind of governance success story, boasting regional integration and open trade, coordinated lawmaking, and shared standards. And to be fair, part of it is genuine has genuinely worked economically. The single market increased trade efficiency enormously. European citizens can move relatively freely across much of the continent. Businesses operate across borders more easily. These are real achievements. But Africa also sees the limitations now, especially the democratic tension underneath highly layered governance systems. The African Union has its own integration ambitions through projects like the African Continental Free Trade Area, but African states are still extremely cautious about surrendering too much sovereignty to supranational institutions, partly because many African countries gained independence relatively recently compared to Europe's older states. So, sovereignty still feels fragile in parts of Africa. It's hard worn, it's personal. There is sensitivity around external influence already when it comes from Western institutions, China, international lenders, or multinational corporations. So when African leaders watch Europe struggle with constitutional identity questions, they are going to learn from it, as they should, right? And there is another layer here involving global power competition. The EU often speaks about democratic values, institutional norms, and rule based governance, but internally it still faces disputes over who ultimately controls the rules. Is it national governments, the European courts, unelected commissioners, technocratic regulators? Citizens notice this ambiguity, increasingly so, especially younger populations who feel disconnected from slow institutional processes while facing rising living costs, migration tensions, energy insecurity, and technological disruption all at once. So, I do not think a single federal constitution solves Europe's problems. Honestly, it may very well intensify them. Europe's strength comes partly from its ability to coordinate without completely erasing national identity. The system survives because countries still feel like participants rather than provinces. Once that balance shifts too far toward central authority, legitimacy weakens. And legitimacy matters more than legal elegance in systems like this. Probably more than Brussels likes admitting sometimes. One thing Europe is discovering now, especially around AI governance and digital regulation, is that institutional legitimacy becomes far more important once systems start affecting everyday life directly. It is one thing for Brussels to regulate trade standards or agricultural subsidies. Most people never think about those things daily. But once institutions begin influencing online speech rules, AI systems, biometric identification standards, content moderation, data transfers, and digital identity frameworks, people suddenly start asking who exactly made these decisions and who gave them the authority to do it. That is where the EU's constitutional ambiguity becomes more visible. The AI Act is a good example of it. The EU positioned itself as one of the first major blocs trying to regulate artificial intelligence comprehensively, and there are understandable reasons for that. Governments are worried about deepfakes, discrimination, automated surveillance, misinformation, labor disruption, the whole works. All of them are real concerns, but the implementation process also exposed how difficult it is to create continent wide governance in a union where populations do not fully share the same political culture. France may prioritize industrial competitiveness. Germany may focus more heavily on privacy. Eastern European countries may worry more about security and information warfare because of proximity to Russia. Different histories produce different fears, and then citizens look upward at institutions that often feel distant. The European Commission proposes regulations, courts interpret them, councils negotiate amendments behind closed doors, national governments blame Brussels when unpopular decisions happen, even if they help negotiate those decisions themselves. That creates this strange accountability fog where responsibility becomes difficult to trace clearly. A federal constitution would not automatically solve that problem. Honestly, it might deepen it by centralizing more authority inside structures that large parts of Europe already feel emotionally disconnected from. You can see similar tensions emerging around migration databases, digital border systems, and online platform regulation. The more governance becomes technological, the more people begin questioning not only the rules themselves, but the architecture behind the rules. Who built these systems? Who maintains them? Who audits them? And maybe more importantly, who benefits when governance shifts away from visible national politics towards technical administrative networks that ordinary people struggle to influence directly? There is also a security dimension here that Europe cannot really avoid anymore. The Russia Ukraine campaign changed the psychological environment inside Europe quite significantly. Before 2022, debates about sovereignty inside the EU often felt mostly economic or legal, like currency rules or trade standards, budget contributions, and such. But once conflict returned at scale to Europe's borders, security questions moved back to the center of political life very quickly. Suddenly, countries started reconsidering defense manufacturing, energy dependence, supply chain resilience, cyber warfare, satellite infrastructure, even. The atmosphere changed. And interestingly, that shift did not automatically strengthen support for federal Europe. In some places, it actually reinforced national instincts. Poland massively expanded military spending while emphasizing national sovereignty strongly. Germany announced defense restructuring but still moved cautiously within its own domestic political constraints. France continued pushing for European strategic autonomy while also protecting its own national defense identity. The system remained fragmented because Europe's nations still calculate risk differently. Even energy policy exposed this. Europe spent years integrating energy markets deeply, particularly through dependence on Russian gas pipelines, before the Ukraine campaign disrupted that movement. Once the crisis hit, every country scrambled to protect domestic stability first. LNG terminals expanded, alternative suppliers were sought, nuclear debates reopened, industrial concerns became much more urgent, and the treaties allowed coordination, yes, but they also revealed how quickly national interests resurface when pressure increases. And honestly, this may be the core misunderstanding behind federalist thinking in Europe. People assume institutional centralization automatically creates strength. Sometimes it does, but sometimes resilience comes from distributed systems where different states retain enough autonomy to adapt independently when conditions change. The EU works partly because it is sort of incomplete. Yes, that sounds strange to say out loud, but the looseness gives the structure breathing room. A rigid constitution could accidentally remove the flexibility that currently prevents disagreements from turning into outright constitutional ruptures. Meanwhile, the wider world is changing too. China operates through centralized state coordination differently from Europe. The United States has a federal constitution, but still experiences deep internal division. Africa is developing regional frameworks while remaining cautious about sovereignty loss. Europe sits somewhere in the middle of all of this, trying to balance integration with national survival instincts simultaneously. That balancing act may look inefficient from the outside, but efficiency is not always the highest political priority. Sometimes stability matters more. And I think this is where the conversation becomes less about constitutions themselves and more about how modern systems distribute power over time. Because today, influence does not only come from armies or elections anymore, it comes from regulatory systems, from financial networks, semiconductor supply chains, from satellite infrastructure, AI standards, energy grids, payment systems, cloud computing. I mean, bruh, what else? So whoever shapes the operating rules inside those systems accumulates influence gradually, often without dramatical political moments announcing it. The EU understands this better than people sometimes give it credit for, because even without becoming a formal federal state, Europe already exercises enormous global influence through regulation alone. Companies across the world adjust their products because EU market access matters. Data privacy rules developed in Brussels shape platform behavior internationally. Environmental standards ripple outward through global supply chains. So the EU already behaves like a power center in many ways, just not a unified nation state. But internally, the legitimacy question keeps returning because people still want proximity to power. They want to feel like they can remove leaders, influence decisions, and recognize the institutions governing them. National governments still provide that emotional connection more effectively than continental bureaucracy does. And maybe that is not a temporary problem waiting to be solved. Maybe it is simply the natural limit of how far political integration can go across dozens of deeply different societies without creating democratic fatigue or backlash. There are signs of this tension spreading through debates about AI regulation, about migration policy and agricultural processes and energy transitions, also digital surveillance, even defense procurement. The more interconnected systems become, the more governance shifts upward into complex institutional layers that ordinary citizens struggle to follow closely. And once people stop understanding where authority actually sits, trust starts weakening slowly, not all at once, but it happens gradually. So the future probably does not belong to rigid federal systems or isolated nation states. It belongs more to networks that can coordinate effectively without destroying legitimacy underneath it. That balance is pretty difficult. Europe is still experimenting with it in real time, but as technological systems grow more powerful and governance becomes increasingly embedded inside infrastructure itself, influence slowly concentrates around whoever designs the rules or maintains the networks or controls the standards and convinces populations that the system still belongs to them in some meaningful way.